Ethan Carter had not spoken a kind word to anyone in 3 years. He had stopped trying, stopped believing it mattered. But the afternoon he walked past the train station and saw a woman sitting alone on a trunk, still wearing her traveling dress in the July heat, her hands folded like she was waiting for a prayer to be answered. Something inside him cracked open that he thought was sealed shut forever. If you're new here, subscribe and stay with me until the very end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far this story travels. The summer of 1883 had already broken 3 men in Caldwell Creek. A wheat farmer named Briggs had sold his mule to buy seed, watched the seed turn to dust, and left with nothing but the shirt on his back. Old Pete Haggerty had tried to sink a new well on the south side of his property and hit nothing but rock 40 feet down. And Will Dunmore, who everyone agreed was the stubbornest man in the valley, had finally let the bank take his land after 14 months of fighting. The land did that to people. It took, and it did not apologize. Ethan Carter understood that better than most. He was 42 years old and looked it, not in a soft way, but in the way of a man who had been outside in hard weather for most of his life. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before the war, and a quietness about him that people sometimes mistook for peace. It was not peace. It was just the place a man arrived when he had run out of things to say. He had been married once. Her name was Margaret. She and the baby had died in the winter of 1877, 3 days apart. The baby first, then Margaret, like one could not bear to go without the other. Ethan had buried them both himself because the ground was too frozen for anyone else to bother coming out. He hadn't asked for help after that. He hadn't asked for much of anything. His ranch, the Double C, named for himself and Margaret in better days, sat 6 miles east of town on the edge of a dry creek bed that only ran water in spring. He kept 40 head of cattle, a working dog named Scout, and a habit of rising before dawn that he'd never been able to shake since the war. He came into Caldwell Creek that Tuesday afternoon only because he needed hinges. 2 on the barn door had rusted through. That was the only reason he was anywhere near the station when the afternoon train pulled in. He was tying his horse at the post outside the hardware store when he heard the commotion. Not a loud one. More like the low murmur a crowd makes when something has gone wrong, and nobody quite wants to be the one to acknowledge it. He glanced down the street. A woman was standing on the platform. She was young, late 20s, he guessed, and she was dressed for travel in a dark blue skirt and a white blouse that was already damp from the heat. She had brown hair pinned up neat, and she was holding a small leather bag in both hands, the way people hold things when they are trying not to show that their hands are shaking. Beside her sat a single trunk. Around her stood nobody. The train had already pulled away. The platform was emptying. A few townspeople had paused to stare. Mrs. Holt from the dry goods store, and the Farley brothers, who always found reasons to lean against the station wall and watch things unfold. But none of them moved toward her. Ethan didn't move toward her either. Not yet. He went into the hardware store, found his hinges, paid for them, and came back out. She was still there. He put the hinges in his saddlebag, checked the buckle, and made himself look down the street again. Still there. An hour passed. He told himself it was none of his business. He went to the feed store. He talked to Roy Gaines about the price of hay, which had gone up again because everything always went up. He bought what he needed and loaded it onto his horse. She was still on that platform when he came out of the feed store. The sun had moved. She had not. Harlan Jacobs, who served as both mayor and the man who collected debts for the bank, was standing near the station entrance now, talking to Sheriff Brooks. Ethan couldn't hear everything, but he caught enough. Ordered her like a catalog item. Fenwick took one look and rode off. What's she supposed to do now? Bill Fenwick. Ethan knew the name. Ran a small outfit on the North Range. A man of moderate cruelty and considerable arrogance, who had apparently decided to order himself a wife from an agency back east, and had apparently decided, upon seeing her in person, that she did not suit him, and had simply left. Ethan stood in the street for a moment with his jaw tight. He watched Mrs. Holt walk past the woman without a word. He watched the Farley brothers snicker at something one of them said. He watched the station master come out, look at the woman, mutter something under his breath, and go back inside. The woman did not cry. She stood straight. She looked out at the street like she was solving a problem in her head. And something about that particular kind of dignity, the kind that comes not from confidence, but from refusing to give anyone the satisfaction, pulled at something in Ethan's chest that hadn't been pulled in years. He crossed the street. He walked up to the platform and stopped 2 feet away from her, and took off his hat the way his mother had taught him a long time ago. "Ma'am," he said. She turned to look at him. Her eyes were dark and steady, and showed nothing. "Sir," she said back. Her voice was composed, Eastern, a little formal.
"I saw the train come in," Ethan said, because he didn't know where else to start.
"Did you?" It wasn't really a question. "I wasn't trying to pry," he said. I noticed you've been standing here a while." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked out at the street, where a few of the townspeople were still watching from a comfortable distance. "I've been standing here long enough to understand the situation," she said. Ethan turned his hat in his hands. "What's your name, ma'am, if you don't mind my asking?" "Clara Whitmore." She said it clearly, without apology. "I came from Philadelphia. I was corresponding with a Mr. William Fenwick for 4 months. He paid for my train ticket." She paused. "He did not pay for a return ticket." Ethan felt something cold settle in his stomach. "No," he said. "I expect he wouldn't have." "Do you know him?" she asked. "I know of him."
"Is he a man who changes his mind often, or was this a particular decision?"
Ethan looked at her. She was asking a real question. She wanted a real answer. "He's not known for changing his mind," Ethan said carefully. "More known for not thinking things through before he makes it." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded, once, like she was filing that information away. "Is there a hotel in this town?" she asked. "There's a boarding house. Mrs. Graves runs it. $2 a week." "And is there work in this town? Anything a woman could do, honestly?" Ethan looked at her. He thought about the double C. He thought about how the kitchen had not been used properly in 6 years because he had never learned to cook and had survived on things that didn't require much skill. He thought about the accounting ledger that he kept in pencil and couldn't make balance no matter how many times he tried.
He thought about how Scout had puppies last spring that he'd given away because there was nobody to mind them. He thought about a lot of things very quickly. "I have a ranch 6 miles out," he said. "It's not much to look at right now. The drought's been hard on it. But I could use help keeping the house in order, and there's some bookkeeping that needs doing." She looked at him steadily. "You're offering me work." "I am." "Not charity." "No, ma'am. Work. Honest pay. You'd have your own room and your meals." She studied him the way a schoolteacher studies a student who is given an unexpected answer. Not with suspicion exactly, but with the attention of someone trying to determine whether the answer is genuine. "Why?" she asked. Ethan could have said something simple. He could have said he needed the help, which was true. He could have said he felt sorry for her, which was also true.
But those weren't the only reasons. Because somebody ought to, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she bent down and picked up the handle of her trunk. "I'll need to see the terms in writing," she said. "I don't write fast," he admitted, "but I'll do my best." "All right," she straightened up. "Mr. Carter, Ethan Carter." "All right, Mr. Carter." She adjusted the bag on her shoulder. "Let's go see this ranch." They stopped at Mrs. Graves' boarding house first, so Clara could wash up and change. Ethan waited outside with the horses, and several people found reasons to pass him on the sidewalk and ask questions that weren't really questions. "That the woman from the train?" said Roy Gaines. "She is," said Ethan. "She going back east?" "Doesn't appear to be." Roy looked at him with the careful expression of a man deciding whether to say something. "People are going to talk, Ethan." "People have always talked," Ethan said. "Hasn't slowed them down yet." Roy moved on. Mrs. Holt was less indirect. "You're taking that woman to your property?" she said, stopping directly in front of him on the boardwalk. She was a stout woman with gray hair and the expression of someone who had appointed herself the moral record-keeper of Caldwell Creek. "I'm offering her employment," Ethan said. "Employment?" She repeated it like the word had an odor. "Ethan Carter, you have lived alone on that property for 6 years. People will say, I'm aware of what people will say, Mrs. Holt. And you don't care. I care that she's got nowhere to go, and it's 100 degrees, and nobody in this town has said one useful word to her in 3 hours." He looked at her. "Do you have a better solution? Or just concerns?" Mrs. Holt opened her mouth, closed it, and walked away. Clara came out 15 minutes later wearing a simpler dress, her hair repinned. She carried the trunk herself until Ethan took it from her. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. He loaded it into the wagon, and they drove out of town without much ceremony. They rode in silence for about 2 miles, which Ethan didn't mind. He'd grown accustomed to silence. But this was a different kind of silence. Not the empty kind, but the kind that happens when two people are both thinking. "You were a soldier," Clara said finally. It was not a question. He glanced at her. "What makes you say that?" "The way you stood back there. Like you were used to standing your ground in uncomfortable situations, without needing it to be comfortable." He was quiet for a moment. 21 to 25. Confederate side, which I expect you probably guessed from the accent. "I did." "Does that bother you?" "I'm from Philadelphia," she said. "But I'm not here to refight the war, Mr. Carter. I'm here because I'm out of options." He appreciated that, the honesty of it. "You said you were a teacher?" he asked. "For 7 years. Primary grades." She looked out at the land. "The school where I taught closed. The town lost its funding. I had some savings and a great deal of optimism, and I answered an advertisement." "Did Fenwick misrepresent himself?" She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "He described himself as a God-fearing man of property, with sound character and a desire for a quiet life." She paused. 2 of those things may have been accurate. "He does have property," Ethan acknowledged. "Yes." Her tone was dry. The property was not misrepresented. Despite everything, Ethan felt something loosen slightly in his chest. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I want to be clear about the arrangement. It's work, house management, some bookkeeping. Nothing else is implied or expected." "I understood that when you said it the first time," she said, "though I appreciate you repeating it. Some people might suggest otherwise, about the arrangement." "Some people," she said, "were watching me stand on a train platform for 3 hours without offering a glass of water." "I'm not particularly concerned with what they suggest." He nodded. "Fair enough." The Double C came into view as the sun was tilting toward the western hills. Ethan watched her take it in. He tried to see it as she would: the cracked front porch, the dry ground, the barn that needed paint, the empty water troughs. "The well's still got water," he said, because it seemed like the most important thing. "Just deep. Have to work the pump hard." Clara was quiet. "It's not much," he said. "No," she agreed, "but it's standing." He wasn't sure if that was encouragement or just an observation. "The inside is—" He paused. "I haven't had much cause to keep it organized." She looked at him. "Mr. Carter, I taught 32 children in a single room for 7 years. I have dealt with worse disorder than a bachelor's kitchen." He almost smiled. He didn't quite get there, but almost. He helped her down from the wagon and pushed open the front door. The kitchen was indeed not organized. The living space was sparse, but not unlivable. There was a back room off the kitchen that had once been used for storage, that had a bed frame in it and a window that let in the evening light. "Will this do?" he asked, standing in the doorway. Clara set her bag on the bed frame and looked around the room. She tested the window. It opened. There was a hook on the door. "This will do," she said. 3 days passed. On the first day, Clara reorganized the kitchen with a systematic efficiency that Ethan found slightly alarming and secretly impressive. She found things he hadn't known he owned: a cast iron pan he'd used as a doorstop, a set of mixing bowls underneath a pile of leather strapping. On the second day, she made biscuits. Ethan had not eaten anything he could genuinely call food in approximately 2 years. He sat at the kitchen table and ate 5 biscuits without saying a word. And Clara sat across from him with a cup of coffee and the ranch ledger open in front of her, making marks in the margin with a pencil. "You're 3 months behind on your account at the feed store," she said. "I know it. And your cattle records don't match. You've got 40 head listed here, but the entries from last spring show 47. "Lost 7 to the heat," he said. "Didn't update it." She made a note. "You'll need to update it. If you ever have to show these accounts to anyone, discrepancies look like dishonesty, even when they're not." He looked at her across the table. "You do this fast." "Numbers were always easier for me than people," she said without looking up. "Is that why you became a teacher?" She glanced at him then. "I became a teacher because I thought I could help children understand the world. I stayed a teacher because the school needed me." She looked back at the ledger. "And I came west because I was tired of being practical and thought it was time to try something brave." Ethan thought about that. "And?" "And apparently, brave and foolish look very similar from the outside," she said. He didn't say anything. On the third day, Victor Langford rode up. Ethan was mending fence on the south pasture when he heard the horses. He counted 4 of them before he turned around. Langford rode in front. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders, with a silver watch chain and a hat that cost more than most men in Caldwell Creek made in a month. He had deep-set eyes and the smile of someone who had never lost anything they didn't choose to give away. Behind him rode 3 men Ethan recognized: Decker, who ran Langford's operation, 2 hired hands whose names he didn't know. "Carter," Langford said, pulling up. "Langford," Ethan said. He did not put down his fence tool. Langford's eyes moved past him toward the house, toward the smoke coming from the chimney, toward Clara, who had come out onto the porch to see what the horses were about. "Heard you had company," Langford said. "You heard right. Woman from the train." "She works here," Ethan said. Langford smiled. It was a patient smile, the kind a man wears when he believes he knows something you don't. "She's going to need somewhere else to work come fall," he said. "You know why I'm here." "Water rights," The creek on your eastern boundary. The flow that comes down from my property in the hills. Langford leaned on his saddle horn. I've been generous, Carter. I've let that water run through your land without charge for years. That water runs through my land because geography put it there, Ethan said. And legal documentation can move geography, Langford said pleasantly. My lawyers are filing this week. You'll have notice by Friday. Come fall, that flow gets redirected. Ethan looked at him steadily. You do that, I lose the rest of my cattle. That's the nature of drought, son. Langford tilted his head. I have a standing offer on this land. $800. That's a fair price. It's not for sale. Not yet, Langford said. He looked at the house again, at Clara on the porch. You're a stubborn man, Carter, but stubborn men break the same as any other kind. They just take longer. He picked up his reins. Friday, have your affairs in order. He turned and rode away, and his men followed, and the dust settled slowly in the heat. Ethan stood in the pasture for a long moment before he turned back to the fence. Clara came down from the porch. I heard, she said. Yeah. What are you going to do? He picked up his wire cutters and looked at the broken fence line. I'm going to finish mending this fence. Ethan, it was the first time she'd used his given name. What are you going to do about Langford? He looked at her. Something in her face, the steadiness of it, the way she stood in the heat like she was ready to hear the truth and do something with it, reminded him, for just a moment, of Margaret. Not in appearance, in quality. I've been thinking about building a dam, he said, up in the basin above the east pasture. If I can capture the seasonal runoff before it reaches Langford's land, I might be able to hold enough water to get through the fall even without the creek. Is that legal? Rain that falls on my land belongs to me. Can you build it alone? He looked at the dry fields and the distant hills. Probably not fast enough. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then you're not going to build it alone, she said. He looked at her. Tell me what needs to be done, she said, and we'll figure out the rest. He stared at her for a long moment, this Eastern schoolteacher in her practical dress, who had been left on a train platform 3 days ago with no plan and no welcome. And something shifted behind his eyes. He nodded. All right, he said. That evening they sat at the kitchen table with a sheet of paper between them, and they made a plan. Ethan sketched the basin with a stick of charcoal. Clara wrote numbers down the side of the page, estimates of how much water they'd need to get 40 head through a dry fall, estimates of how much stone and timber they'd have to source, estimates of what favors he still had to call in from neighbors who owed him. There's a family named Whitaker 3 miles north, Ethan said. I helped them rebuild their barn after the storm in '81. Pete Whitaker said if I ever needed anything. Write it down, Clara said. He wrote it down. Who else? Old Tomas Ruiz, rancher on the south end. We've helped each other through 2 bad winters. Write it down. He wrote it down. The list grew slowly. When they finished, it had 7 names on it. That might be enough, Clara said. Might be. She looked across the table at him. You've spent a long time doing things alone, haven't you? He didn't answer right away. He looked at the list of names. It's easier, he said finally. When something goes wrong, it's only your fault. And when something goes right? He looked up. She was watching him with those dark, steady eyes. When something goes right, she said quietly, you have nobody to share it with. The lamp burned low between them. Outside, the summer wind came up slow off the hills, and somewhere in the dark, a coyote called out once, and was answered by nothing. Ethan looked at the list of names on the page, at the plan they had made together. at the woman sitting across from him, who had been thrown away like something of no value, and who had, in 3 days, made this house feel different in a way he couldn't quite name. He thought about what Langford had said. Stubborn men break the same as any other kind. Maybe so. But they didn't break alone. Not anymore. The morning after they made the plan, Ethan rode out before dawn. Clara heard him go. She had not slept well. The heat, the unfamiliar sounds, the particular silence of a place that had been empty of people for a long time. And she was already sitting at the kitchen table with the ledger open when she heard the horse's hooves leave the yard. She didn't ask where he went when he came back 2 hours later. She poured him coffee and set it on the table and waited. He sat down and wrapped both hands around the cup. "Pete Whitaker says yes," he said. "He'll bring his 2 boys and whatever tools he's got. Says he can come Saturday." "That's 4 people," Clara said. "Tomas Ruiz says he'll come, but only for 2 days. His wife's not well." "2 days is 2 days," she said. "Did you ask the others?" "Working on it." He drank the coffee. "There's a young hand who works for nobody permanent right now. Luke Hadley, 20 years old. He does day work when he can get it. I thought I'd offer him wages for the build." "Can we afford that?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. "We need to afford it," he said. That was when Clara understood something she hadn't fully understood before. This wasn't just stubbornness. This was survival. And Ethan Carter had been surviving alone for so long that he'd stopped noticing the difference between holding on and slowly letting go. She turned to a fresh page in the ledger. "Then we find a way to afford it." He watched her write. "You always do that?" he said. "Do what?" "Find the practical answer before the emotional one." She looked up. "I find both at the same time," she said. "I just deal with the practical one first." He nodded slowly, like that made sense to him. Like maybe he did the same thing. "I'll ride to Luke's place this afternoon," he said. "All right." She looked back at the page. "Ethan." "Yeah?" "When you asked those men, did any of them ask about me?" He set the cup down, looked at her straight. "Pete Whitaker asked if the story about the train was true." "What did you tell him?" "I told him it was, and that you were working here, and that his opinion on the matter was his own business." Clara held his gaze for a moment. "Thank you," she said. He picked up his cup again. "Don't thank me for common decency, Miss Whitmore. That's a low bar to set." She almost smiled. "Then I'll thank you for setting it, Mr. Carter." He left before she could say anything else. Luke Hadley was younger than Ethan had described. He showed up at the Double C on a Thursday morning, with a battered hat and an expression of permanent cheerfulness that Ethan found grating, and Clara found immediately endearing. "You must be Miss Whitmore," he said, tipping his hat with enthusiasm. "Mr. Carter says you're the one keeping the books straight." "Mr. Carter overestimates my progress," Clara said. "Come in." Luke sat at the kitchen table and ate half a plate of cornbread while Ethan explained the dam project. The boy listened with his head tilted to one side and a piece of cornbread in his hand, and the focused expression of someone who was a great deal smarter than he looked. "So what you're trying to do," Luke said, "is catch the runoff before it gets to Langford's property line." "Before it reaches his diversion channel," Ethan said. "He's got men who can redirect that flow into his own basin. I need to get there first." "That's going to make him mad," Luke said cheerfully. "He's already mad." "Madder then?" "Probably." Luke thought about it for another moment, then set down his cornbread. "I'll do it," he said. $2 a day, and I'll work as long as you need me." "1.5, Ethan said. $1.75, Luke said, "and I bring my own tools." They shook hands. Clara wrote it in the ledger. Luke glanced at the ledger and then at Clara. "You're real organized for someone who just got here," he said, not unkindly. "I'm real organized in general," she said. "Is that a Philadelphia thing?" "It's a school teacher thing." Luke grinned. "Yes, ma'am."
The work on the dam began Saturday, which meant 6 people, 24 tools, 300 pounds of stone, and one significant problem. The ground was harder than Ethan had estimated. They'd been at it for 4 hours when Pete Whitaker's older boy, Nathan, put his pick through the surface layer and hit something that rang out like iron under the earth. "Rock shelf," Nathan said. He was 18 and practical in the way of boys who'd grown up working. "Goes maybe 8 feet down from here. You're not cutting through that without blasting." Ethan crouched and dug at the edge of the line with his hands. He felt the shelf. The boy was right. "We reroute," he said. "That adds 2 days to the build," Pete Whitaker said. "Then it adds 2 days." Pete looked at him. "Tomas only gave us 2 days, Ethan. You lose him before we finish the base, you're short on hands." "I know it. You want to tell him that, or should I?" Tomas Ruiz was a quiet man with a white mustache and the kind of patience that only came from having survived many difficult things. He listened while Ethan explained the problem. He looked at the rock shelf. He looked at the rerouted line that Nathan had sketched in the dirt. Then he looked at Ethan. "My wife would say I should come home tomorrow," he said. "I know," Ethan said. "But my wife also said I should have come here 2 years ago when your well started running low." He picked up his shovel. "She's usually right about the first thing. We'll see about this one." He stayed 3 days instead of 2. Clara brought lunch up to the worksite both days, biscuits and dried beef and water from the well, hauled in a bucket that she carried herself across the dry ground without complaint, even when the sun was straight overhead and the heat was genuinely dangerous. On the second day, Luke took the bucket from her on her 3rd trip. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "with respect, you look like you're about to melt." "I'm fine," she said. "You're not fine. You're approximately the color of boiled flour." She looked at him. "Are you always this direct?" "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Carter says it's my worst quality." "What does Mr. Carter say is your best quality?" Luke grinned. "He says I work hard enough to make up for the rest." She handed him the bucket. "Then go work hard." But she watched him go, and she watched Ethan at the far end of the work line, driving stone with a focus that shut out everything else, and she thought, "This man is putting everything he has into this ground, and he is doing it not just to save his land, but because giving up would mean that Langford was right, and Margaret was gone, and the war had taken more from him than just the years." She thought, "That's not stubbornness. That's a man trying to stay alive in a way that matters." She picked up the empty bucket and went back to the well. The trouble came on a Wednesday afternoon, in the form of a rider in a good suit. He introduced himself as Mr. Gerald Foss, representing the legal interests of Victor Langford, and he had a document in his hand and the composed expression of a man who delivered bad news for a living. Ethan was at the dam site when Luke came running. "Man from town," Luke said, slightly out of breath. "Lawyer. Miss Whitmore is talking to him." Ethan put down his tool and walked back to the house. Clara was standing on the porch with her arms crossed and the lawyer on the lower step. She had the look of someone who had been listening for some time and had heard enough. "Mr. Carter," the lawyer said, turning, "I have a cease and desist order signed by Judge Whitmore." "No relation," Clara said dryly. The lawyer ignored her. "Regarding your construction on the Eastern Basin, Mr. Langford contends that the basin floor sits within the water rights corridor defined in the original land survey of 1871, and that any structure built within that corridor constitutes interference with his established rights." Ethan took the document, read it.
read it again. "The basin floor is on my land," he said. The water rights corridor extends along the creek bed," Ethan said. "Not the basin. The basin is 40 feet above the creek bed. You can see that on the same survey you're quoting." The lawyer blinked. He had not expected that. "Mr. Langford's position," Ethan said, "is that he owns everything between here and the horizon, and the rest of us are just renting it from him temporarily." He held out the document. "This paper doesn't hold. Tell him to try again." The lawyer took the document back with a careful expression. "I'll relay your response." "You do that." After the lawyer left, Luke said, "You sure about that? The survey thing?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. Luke's expression dropped. "Then why?" "Because he's not sure about it either," Clara said quietly from the porch. Both men looked at her. "If he were sure, the order would have been signed by a judge in Abilene, not a local justice of the peace who owes Langford favors. He's testing how much you know." She looked at Ethan. "We need to verify the survey. Is there a copy somewhere?" "County Records Office in Harker City," Ethan said. "That's 40 miles. "Yeah." "I'll go," she said. Both men looked at her. "It's 40 miles, Ethan repeated. "I heard you the first time." She met his eyes. "Can you spare the wagon for 2 days?" He studied her for a long moment. She did not flinch. "Luke'll go with you," he said. "I don't need he's going with you," Ethan said. And something in his voice had changed slightly. Not commanding, not dismissive, but careful. Like he'd said a thing he wasn't sure he had the right to say, but said it anyway. Clara looked at him for another moment. Then she nodded. "Fine." Luke looked between them with the expression of a young man who understood that something had just happened that had nothing to do with 40 miles and the county records office. He said nothing, which was, for once, the smartest thing he could have done. They left before sunrise. Ethan loaded provisions onto the wagon without a word. Clara climbed up beside Luke, and they drove out, and Ethan stood in the yard and watched them go until they were lost in the dark. He went back to the dam. He worked through the morning alone. Pete and his boys had gone back to their own place the day before. And the silence that came back felt different now than it had 3 weeks ago. It had a shape to it. A recently vacated kind of emptiness that was worse, somehow, than the old kind. Because the old kind you were used to. By noon, Pete's younger boy came back without warning. Said his father had sent him because nobody should be moving rock alone in this heat. And got to work without asking any other questions. Ethan was grateful, in a way he didn't know how to express, so he didn't try. Clara and Luke reached Harker City by late afternoon. The county records office was a small room in the back of the courthouse, staffed by a man named Clarence, who was suspicious of strangers and deeply protective of his filing system. Clara talked to him for 45 minutes. Luke watched from the doorway and decided at some point that she could have talked a rock into confessing to a crime it hadn't committed. She came out with a hand-copied transcription of the relevant survey section. "The basin is above the corridor," she said, unfolding it in the last of the afternoon light. "The water rights apply to the creek bed and its direct tributaries below the 200-foot elevation line. The basin sits at 240 feet. Luke read it over her shoulder. So Langford's lawyer knew the order wouldn't hold. He knew, and he filed it anyway. She folded the paper carefully. He's hoping Ethan doesn't know what he knows. That's a coward's move, Luke said. It's an expensive man's move, Clara said, which is often worse. She tucked the paper into her bag. Luke looked at her. You always been like this? Like what? Like, you just walk into a room and figure out what's wrong and fix it. She was quiet for a moment. I had 32 children in a single classroom, and a principal who checked in once a month, and a school board that cared mostly about appearances. You learn to solve problems yourself, or nothing gets solved. You miss it? She looked at him. It was a real question, and she considered giving a dismissive answer, and then decided against it. Yes, she said. I miss the children. I don't miss the feeling that I was managing a situation that was shrinking. And now? She looked out at the darkening sky. Now I'm in a situation that is either expanding or collapsing, she said. I'm not sure which yet. Luke thought about that on the whole ride back. They returned to the Double C on the second morning. Ethan was at the dam when he heard the wagon. He came across the pasture and met them in the yard, and Clara climbed down and handed him the folded survey transcription before he could say a word. He read it. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes settled into a steadier place. It holds, he said. It holds, she confirmed. He looked at her, at the road dust on her dress and the tiredness under her eyes from 2 days of rough travel, and the way she was standing with her shoulders straight despite all of it. Thank you, he said. It was 40 miles, she said. Not a hardship. Clara. Again, her name in his voice, direct and quiet, like something he had to choose to say. Thank you. She held his gaze. In 6 years he had said thank you to very few people. She could hear that in how he said it. You're welcome, she said. And that, between the two of them, was almost everything. The dam reached its base layer on Friday evening. It wasn't finished. There were 3 more days of work on the wall itself, setting stone, sealing gaps, building the overflow channel that would direct excess water during a real rain. But the foundation was in the ground, the shape of the thing was visible, and the work had not been stopped. They ate dinner on the porch that night, all 4 of them who were still there, Ethan and Clara and Luke and Pete Whitaker's youngest boy, Henry, who was 15 and had earned his place without anyone having to tell him to. Nobody said much. That was fine. Henry pointed out that there were more stars visible than he'd seen all summer. That mean rain? Luke asked. Don't know, Henry said. My father says you can't read stars. My father said the same thing, Ethan said. He was right about almost nothing else. Luke laughed. Henry laughed. Even Clara made a sound that was quieter, but real. Ethan looked at the stars. He thought about Langford, about the cease and desist that hadn't held, about the legal filing that was coming on Friday, which was tomorrow now, about the water rights corridor and the survey and the 40 feet of elevation that stood between him and losing everything. He thought about the 7 names on a list and the survey transcription in Clara's careful handwriting, and the way she had stood in front of a courthouse records clerk for 45 minutes and come out with what they needed. He thought about how this house felt different now. Not fixed, not saved, not healed, but occupied. The way a house should feel. He didn't know what that meant yet. He wasn't ready to know. But he was, for the first time in a long time, willing to find out. Then the sound of hoofbeats broke the quiet. Not one rider, at least 4, coming fast. Luke was on his feet before Ethan had even turned. Henry went pale. Clara set down her cup without a sound. Ethan stood up and looked down the dark road where the dust rose against the stars. The riders came out of the dark at a speed that meant they weren't delivering a message. They were delivering something else entirely. And whatever it was not going to wait until morning. There were 5 of them. Ethan counted without moving. 5 horses, 5 riders, and the lead man carrying a torch that threw orange light across the yard in a way that was meant to be seen from a distance. A warning before a threat. The kind of entrance that said, "We are not afraid of witnesses." Luke stepped to Ethan's left without being asked. Henry moved back toward the door. Clara stayed where she was. The lead rider pulled up 10 feet from the porch and let the horse settle. His name was Cord Decker, Langford's foreman, a former cattle drover from Oklahoma with a flat face and the particular calm of a man who had done difficult things for other men's money and stopped feeling much about it.
"Carter," Decker said. Not a greeting, just identification. "Decker." Ethan stepped off the porch. "You're on my land." For now, Decker let his eyes move around the yard, the barn, the half-finished water trough, the survey papers Clara had brought back, visible on the porch table. His eyes stopped there for a moment. "Mr. Langford got word you went to Harker City." "Man's allowed to travel," Ethan said. "Man's allowed to do a lot of things." Decker shifted in the saddle. "Mr. Langford wanted me to remind you that the legal notice expires at noon tomorrow. After that, the creek gets redirected whether you've got a dam or not. Tell Mr. Langford the survey disagrees with him." Decker's expression didn't change. "Mr. Langford doesn't much care what a survey says." "Then Mr. Langford should find himself a judge who agrees with him," Clara said from the porch. "A real one, in a real courthouse, with real jurisdiction." Every man in the yard looked at her. Decker looked at her the longest. "Ma'am," he said in a tone that was not respectful, "you're new here." "I am," she said, "which means I still find it surprising when men ride onto another man's property at night, carrying torches to deliver messages that could have been sent by post." Something shifted in Decker's jaw. He looked back at Ethan. "The dam's an obstacle. The dam is on my land." "The dam," Decker said, and his voice had changed now, lower, with a flat edge underneath it, "is something Mr. Langford would like to see not standing by morning." The yard went very quiet. Luke made a sound, not quite a word, just a breath of disbelief. Ethan said nothing for 3 full seconds. He let the silence work on every man there. Then he said, "You tell Victor Langford that if one stone of that dam is touched, I will ride to Harker City myself and file a criminal complaint with the federal marshal's office. Not a civil matter. Criminal." Decker studied him. "You'd have to prove it was us." "I've got 4 witnesses standing right here," Ethan said. "You want to count them again?" Decker's eyes moved to Luke, to Henry, to Clara on the porch. "That woman," he said slowly, "is not going to be a welcome presence in this valley much longer." Something happened in Ethan's posture. It was not dramatic. He did not raise his voice. But every person in that yard felt it. A quality of stillness that was more dangerous than movement. The way a rope goes tight before it snaps. "Say that again," Ethan said, very quietly. Decker looked at him for a long moment. Whatever he saw in Ethan's face made him pull his horse back a half step, before he'd decided to. "Noon tomorrow," Decker said. He turned his horse. "Think hard tonight, Carter." They rode out. The torch disappeared down the road. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Henry sat down on the porch steps, like his legs had decided without consulting him. Luke let out a breath he'd been holding for 2 minutes. Clara picked up the survey papers from the table and folded them and put them in her pocket without saying anything. Ethan stood in the yard, looking at the dark road. "Ethan," Luke's voice. Careful. "What do we do?" Ethan turned around. He looked at the dam, 200 yards across the pasture. At the foundation they had spent 10 days building. At the stone wall they had 3 more days of work to finish. "We finish the dam tonight," he said. Luke blinked. "Tonight? All of it?" "As much as we can."
That's 4 or 5 hours of work. Then we start now. Luke looked at Henry. Henry looked at Clara. Clara was already walking toward the tool shed. They worked by lantern light. It was the hardest work Ethan had done since the war, not because the labor was different, but because it was dark, and the heat hadn't broken, and every sound from the road made every person there stop and listen. Luke and Henry moved stone. Ethan set them. Clara did the mixing for the mortar joints, a recipe she'd figured out herself from lime and creek clay and a stubbornness that refused to accept that she couldn't learn something new. Around midnight, Henry dropped his end of a stone and sat down and said, "I can't do any more." Nobody told him he had to. Luke handed him a water tin, and they kept going. By 2 in the morning, the main wall was set, not cured, not sealed, but standing. Ethan ran his hand along the top course of stone. In the lantern light, it looked solid. He knew it wasn't fully solid yet. The mortar needed time. But it would hold water pressure if rain came within the next few days. Maybe. Maybe was the best he had. He turned around, and Luke was sitting on the ground with his hat over his face. Henry had fallen asleep against the wall itself, the side he hadn't been working on, as if he'd trusted it with his weight before he'd even decided to sit down. Clara was standing at the edge of the basin, looking at the dry floor below. Her sleeves were rolled. There was lime dust on her forearms, and a smear of something dark across her jaw that she hadn't noticed. Ethan walked over and stood beside her. "It's done," she said. "The hard part," he said. "Still needs the overflow channel." "Tomorrow." "Yeah." She was quiet. Then, "He threatened me." "I heard him." "He meant it to land as a threat to you. Through me." She said it without drama, like she was just clarifying the geometry of it. "He wanted to see if you'd react." "Did it work?" She turned to look at him. "You tell me." He looked back at her directly. In the dark, with the lantern burning low between them, he said the thing he'd been deciding whether to say. "You're not on your own here. Whatever Langford's men say, whatever this town decides about you, you're not on your own." She held his gaze. Her expression didn't collapse into relief or soften into gratitude. It did something quieter than that. It settled. Like a question she'd been carrying had found an answer she could actually use. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. They stood together for another minute in the dark, not saying anything else, not needing to. Noon came and went on Thursday, and nothing happened. No riders, no legal notices, no further word from Langford. That silence was not comfortable. Ethan knew the difference between an enemy who had given up and an enemy who was recalibrating, and this felt like the second kind. He finished the overflow channel by late afternoon with Luke's help. Clara spent the morning reinforcing the mortar joints, working with a methodical patience that Luke said, quietly, he had never seen in anyone who wasn't getting paid specifically to care. "She's getting paid," Ethan said. "Not enough for this," Luke said. Ethan didn't reply to that. What he thought about instead was the look on Clara's face when Decker had spoken to her the night before. Not fear. Something harder than fear. Recognition. The recognition of someone who had been discarded once already and could see the shape of it coming again. He thought about how she had not moved from the porch, how she had spoken back. He thought about how Margaret, in the last year of her life, when things were very hard, used to say that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision that something else mattered more. He picked up a mortar tool and went back to work before he finished that thought. The letter arrived Friday morning, not from Langford's lawyer this time, from the county land office in Harker City, addressed to Ethan Carter, written in official language that took him 3 readings to fully parse. He read it at the kitchen table. Clara sat across from him and watched his face. "What does it say?" she asked. He set it down. Langford filed a competing land claim on the basin. He's arguing that the basin floor was historically used as a water collection point for his cattle in the 1870s, which, under territorial usage law, creates a prior use right. Clara stared at him. That's a completely different legal argument than the water rights corridor." He dropped the first one and filed the second. "When?" "2 days ago, the same day you came back from Harker City." He looked at her. He knew the survey didn't support him, so he changed the argument. Prior use. She pressed her fingertips to the table.
Can he prove that? That his cattle used the basin? He's been ranching here since '71. His cattle ranged all across this valley. Proving they drank from the basin floor would be almost impossible to disprove, she finished. The kitchen was very quiet. "Ethan," she said, "who in this town knew Langford before '75? Someone who would remember where his cattle ranged?" He thought. "Old Pastor Reed. Samuel Reed. He came out here in '68. He's seen everything that's happened in this valley." Would he testify? He's a pastor. He doesn't lie. And he doesn't like Langford. 2 qualities that don't always go together. Ethan pushed back from the table. "But a pastor's testimony in a land dispute gets us to the hearing," Clara said. "We don't need to win in court. We need to delay long enough for the dam to cure and for the rains to come." She met his eyes. If water fills that basin before the hearing date, the argument changes entirely. We're not fighting over what might happen. We're fighting over what already happened. He stared at her. "You figured that out right now," he said. "I figured that out when Decker said he wanted the dam gone by morning," she said. He didn't want it gone because of a legal argument. He wanted it gone because a standing, functioning dam is a different kind of problem than a construction site. Ethan sat with that for a moment. "You should have been a lawyer." "I should have been a great many things," she said. "Right now, I'm your bookkeeper. Go talk to Pastor Reed." Pastor Samuel Reed lived on the edge of town in a small house attached to the chapel where he'd held services for 15 years. He was 71 years old, thin as wire, with white hair and sharp eyes, and the manner of a man who had heard every variety of human confession and remained unsurprised by all of them. He answered the door before Ethan knocked twice. "I wondered when you'd come," Reed said. Ethan took off his hat. "You heard. I hear everything in this town, son. The walls are thin, and people talk loud when they think they're being quiet." He stepped back from the door. "Come in." The inside of Reed's house smelled like old books and coffee. He poured 2 cups without asking and sat down across from Ethan and folded his hands on the table. "The basin," Ethan said. "Did Langford's cattle ever use it?" Reed looked at him steadily. "His cattle ranged to the North Ridge, not the Eastern Basin. The basin was too far east for his summer range. His southern herd used the creek below your property line, which is why he wants the water rights to the creek." "You'd swear to that?" "I'd tell the truth to that," Reed said, "which is the same thing." Ethan leaned forward. "He's got money and lawyers and a justice of the peace who owes him favors." "He does," Reed agreed. "A pastor's word against all of that carries more weight than you'd think," Reed said, "with people who aren't already sold to him." He looked at Ethan with the expression of someone about to say something that mattered. "What concerns me, Ethan, is not whether I can help you with the hearing. I can. What concerns me is what Langford does before the hearing." Ethan went still. "What do you mean?" Reed was quiet for a moment. 3 days ago, I saw 2 of his men talking to Bill Fenwick." The name landed like a stone.
Fenwick. The man who had ordered Clara on the train. The man who had ridden away, laughing. "What kind of talking?" Ethan said. Reed's expression was careful. The kind where one man is listening very closely to what the other man says, and the other man is nodding the way people nod when they're being told what to do. Ethan put his cup down on the table. He put it down without breaking it, which took more control than it should have. "What would Fenwick want with this?" he asked, though he already felt the shape of the answer forming in his chest like something cold. "Fenwick embarrassed himself," Reed said. "Men like that need to explain their embarrassments away. If the woman he rejected ends up associated with scandal—" Reed paused. "If someone were to make claims about the nature of her arrangement at your ranch—" "She works there," Ethan said. His voice was flat. "I know that, son. She sleeps in the back room. She keeps the books. I know that," Reed said again, gently. "But knowing something and being able to prove it to people who are already inclined to believe the worst are two different problems." He looked at him. "If Langford uses Fenwick to attack her reputation, he can't use a woman's reputation as a legal strategy in a land dispute," Ethan said. "No," Reed said, "but he can use it to make her a liability to you, to make you choose between protecting her and fighting him." The old man's eyes were direct and not unkind. "To make you give up the land to protect her from what people will say." The room was very quiet. Ethan sat with that for a long, hard moment. He thought about Clara on the train platform, holding her bag with both hands, waiting for a prayer to be answered. He thought about what she'd said. "I'm in a situation that is either expanding or collapsing." He thought about Decker's voice when he said, "That woman is not going to be a welcome presence in this valley much longer." They weren't after the land. They were after her. The land was the thing Ethan would fight for. She was the thing he would break for. Langford had figured that out before Ethan had. He stood up. "I need to get back," he said. Reed rose with him. "Ethan." He put a hand on his arm. The grip was surprisingly firm for an old man. "What are you going to do?" Ethan looked at him. Something had settled in his expression. Not resignation, not anger. A kind of clarity. The way a man looks when he has stopped calculating his options and started moving toward the only one that matters. "Whatever needs doing," he said. He was back on his horse in 2 minutes. He rode hard. He was a mile from the double C when he saw the smoke. It was thin, not a house fire, not the barn, but it was coming from the direction of the east pasture, from the direction of the dam. He pushed the horse into a run. When he came over the rise and saw the basin, his stomach dropped. 2 men, crowbars. They had already broken through the overflow channel and were working at the upper right corner of the wall, the section that was least cured, the mortar still soft from last night. And one of them was Bill Fenwick. Ethan pulled up hard. He came off the horse before it had stopped moving. "Fenwick," he said. Both men turned. Fenwick had the look of someone who had been waiting for this, who had arranged for this moment specifically, and was satisfied that it had arrived. "Carter," Fenwick said. He was holding the crowbar loosely. "You got something on your land that doesn't belong here." "You're the only thing on my land that doesn't belong here." "I mean the dam." Fenwick looked at the wall like it offended him personally. "Water rights in this valley go through Langford. You know that. Everybody knows that." "Everybody knows a lot of things that aren't true," Ethan said. He moved toward them. "Put it down." The second man, one of Langford's hands, younger, with an uncertain expression that said he had not fully thought through what he was doing here, took a half step back. Fenwick did not move. "The woman," he said. "You send her back." Ethan stopped. "What?" "Send her back east," Fenwick said. Whatever you're paying her, whatever you told her, it ends. She goes back, and we walk away from this dam like we were never here." The offer hung in the summer air. Ethan looked at Fenwick, at the crowbar, at the corner of the dam wall where 2 hours of good mortar work had already been undone. He looked at Bill Fenwick, this man who had ordered a woman like livestock, discarded her on a platform, and was now standing on his land, using her as a bargaining chip in someone else's scheme. And he felt something rise in him that was very old and not entirely controlled. "She's not mine to send anywhere," Ethan said. "Then she's your problem." "She's never been a problem," Ethan said. "But you're becoming one." He took the last 3 steps toward Fenwick, and he took the crowbar. He didn't have to hit anyone. He simply took it, pulled it from Fenwick's grip with the flat certainty of a man who had decided the time for talking was finished. And Fenwick, who was not actually brave, let it go. The younger hand dropped his own tool and stepped back fully. Fenwick looked at Ethan. The confidence in his face had gone somewhere else. "You're making an enemy," Fenwick said. "You made yourself an enemy when you left a woman on a train platform in July heat and rode away laughing," Ethan said. "I'm just the part of the story where it catches up to you." Fenwick left. The younger hand left without looking at either of them. Ethan stood at the dam for a long time after they were gone. He assessed the damage. One section of overflow channel broken. The upper corner cracked, but not collapsed. 2 hours of work to fix, maybe 3. He set the crowbar on the ground. He pulled a stone from the loose pile at his feet and began. He was still working when Luke arrived, 30 minutes later, at a dead run from the direction of the house. "Miss Whitmore sent me," Luke said, catching his breath. "She saw the smoke." "I know," Ethan said. "Fenwick?" "Yeah." Luke looked at the damage, then at Ethan. "How bad?" "Fixable," Ethan said. "Get the mortar." Luke went. Ethan worked. Above them both, the sky to the west had changed color in the last hour. Not the dull bronze of another hot afternoon. Something darker. Something with weight behind it. Luke came back with a mortar bucket and looked up at that sky and said, in the voice of a man who had grown up reading weather, "Ethan." "I see it," Ethan said. "Is that—" "Yeah," Ethan said. "Work faster." Because the clouds building on the western horizon were the color of something that had been promised for a very long time. And the dam that stood between everything and nothing had 2 broken sections and mortar that needed 12 hours to cure. And the rain, if it came tonight, would not wait. The rain did not come that night. It came close. The clouds built all evening, dark and heavy and promising. And the wind shifted twice in ways that made Luke look at the sky with the concentrated attention of a man waiting for a verdict. But by midnight the clouds had moved north, and the stars came back out, and the valley stayed dry. Ethan worked through it without stopping. By 2 in the morning, the broken section of overflow channel was repaired. By 4, the cracked corner of the wall had been remortared and braced with a flat stone wedge that wasn't elegant, but would hold. By the time the sky went gray in the east, the dam was standing again. Not perfect, not cured, but standing. Luke had worked beside him the whole night without being asked to stay. They walked back to the house in the early light and sat on the porch without talking. Clara brought out coffee and set it between them, and sat down herself with her own cup, and nobody said anything for a while, because there wasn't anything that needed saying right at that moment. Then Luke said, "What happens at the hearing?" Ethan looked at the dry fields. "We make the case." "And if the case isn't enough?" "Then we make a different one." Luke turned his cup in his hands. "Langford's got Judge Haverford in his pocket. Everybody knows it." "A hearing in front of Haverford is, The hearing isn't in front of Haverford, Clara said. Both men looked at her. I wrote to the Federal Land Office in Abilene on Wednesday, she said, while you were at Reed's. I sent them a copy of the survey transcript and a summary of Langford's two filings, the water rights corridor claim and the prior use claim. I explained that the prior use claim was filed 2 days after the first claim was disproved by county records, which establishes a pattern of legal harassment rather than a legitimate dispute. Ethan stared at her. I also pointed out, she continued, that a prior use claim requires corroborating evidence from at least 2 independent witnesses, and that filing without that evidence already in hand violates territorial filing procedure. She took a sip of her coffee. The Federal Land Office has jurisdiction over contested water rights claims. They can supersede local authority. The porch was very quiet. Luke said slowly, "You did all of that on Wednesday." "I had time in the afternoon. While you were finishing the overflow channel, yes." Luke looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Clara. "When do you expect a response?" Ethan asked. "I sent it by telegraph from Harker City when we were there. I paid for a priority reply." She set her cup down. "It should come today or tomorrow." Ethan was quiet for a moment. He felt something he had not felt in a very long time. The particular off-balance sensation of discovering that someone had thought further ahead than you had and done it quietly, without needing to tell you until it mattered. "You didn't mention this," he said. "I wasn't sure it would work," she said. "I didn't want to give you something to count on that might not arrive." He looked at her for a long moment. "You make a habit of carrying things alone." Something crossed her face. "I learned it," she said quietly. "When you're the one everyone forgets to consult, you stop announcing your plans and start just handling things." The morning air sat between them. "You're not forgotten here," he said. She looked at him. In the early light, with the tiredness of a sleepless night under her eyes, and the dried mortar dust still in the hem of her dress, she looked like someone who had walked a very long distance, and was only now allowing herself to notice it. "I know," she said, and then, more quietly, "That's new." The telegram arrived at noon. Sheriff Daniel Brooks brought it himself, which was the first surprise, because Brooks was not a man who went out of his way for people who were in conflict with Victor Langford. He had spent 12 years maintaining a careful, deliberate neutrality between whatever Langford wanted and whatever the law actually required, and that balancing act had worn lines into his face that hadn't been there when he was younger. He pulled up at the Double C and dismounted and held out the envelope to Ethan without preamble. "Came to the office," Brooks said. "Addressed care of county authority. That's me." Ethan opened it, read it. His expression did not change. He handed it to Clara. She read it. Something in her shoulders settled a fraction. "What's it say?" Luke asked. "The Federal Land Office in Abilene is opening a review of both filings," Clara said. "Pending review, all local proceedings regarding the basin water rights are stayed. No local court can rule on the matter until the federal review is complete." Luke blinked. "Stayed? That means—" "It means Haverford can't touch it," Ethan said. He looked at Brooks. The sheriff stood with his hat in his hands and a complicated expression on his face. "Langford's going to be angry," he said. "Langford's been angry," Ethan said. "It hasn't slowed him down much." "Federal involvement is different," Brooks said. "He's got connections up in Abilene, too." "Maybe," Clara said. "But federal procedure moves slower than local favors, and procedure leaves a record." Brooks looked at her. He had the expression of a man reassessing something he'd previously decided. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "if you don't mind my asking, how do you know territorial filing procedure?" "I taught school for 7 years," she said. "One of my students' fathers was a land attorney. He used to send his son to school with case files to practice his reading." She paused.
I read ahead of him. Brooks made a sound that was almost a laugh. He caught it before it arrived. I see. He put his hat back on. There's going to be a town meeting, Langford called it, tonight at the church. About the dam? Ethan asked. About the dam. About the federal filing. About... Brooks paused. About the woman living at your property. Ethan went very still. He's going to use Fenwick, Brooks said. He said it plainly, like a man who had made a decision to stop being neutral and was dealing with the discomfort of it. Fenwick's been talking around town, about Miss Whitmore's character, about the arrangement here. He looked at Ethan directly. I think you should be at that meeting. I intend to be, Ethan said. Both of you, Brooks said. He glanced at Clara. If she's willing. Clara looked at Ethan, then at the sheriff. I'll be there, she said. Brooks nodded once and rode back toward town. The church was full by the time they arrived. That was itself a kind of answer to a question Ethan had been holding all afternoon. How many people in Caldwell Creek would show up to watch Victor Langford decide the fate of a man who had asked nothing from them for 6 years? The answer was, all of them. Every family in the valley, every rancher and shopkeeper and hired hand. The Whitaker family in the third row. Tomas Ruiz in the back, standing against the wall with his arms folded. Mrs. Holt in the second row, with the posture of someone who had been saving her opinion for exactly this moment. And up at the front, Langford himself. He stood with his thumbs in his vest pockets and the composed authority of a man who had decided the outcome before the meeting started. Gerald Foss, his lawyer, sat to one side with a leather case of documents. Bill Fenwick sat behind them, wearing a clean shirt and the expression of someone who believed this was his moment. Ethan walked in with Clara beside him, and Luke 3 steps back. The talking in the room went quiet. Not entirely, but enough. They took seats on the right side, midway back. Ethan put his hat on his knee. Clara folded her hands in her lap. Her face was composed in that particular way of hers, not cold, but sealed. The look of a woman who had decided what she was walking into and made peace with it before she crossed the threshold. Langford didn't look at them right away. He let the room settle. He was good at this, the theater of it, the way a powerful man uses silence to remind everyone who has the most of it. Then he cleared his throat and began. He talked about water rights. He talked about the valley's history, about his family having been here since the beginning, about the obligations of stewardship. He used the word stewardship 4 times. He talked about the importance of legal order. He talked about what happened to communities that allowed individuals to disrupt established arrangements. It was a very good speech. Ethan could see people in the room nodding. Then Langford said, "But there's another matter," and the room went to a different kind of quiet. "This valley has standards," Langford said. His voice shifted, still controlled, but carrying something harder underneath. Standards of decency, of respectability. When an unmarried woman takes up residence at a bachelor's property, "She works there," said a voice. Everyone looked. It was Nathan Whitaker, Pete's older boy, 18 years old, sitting straight in the third row. Langford paused. It was a very brief pause, but everyone caught it. "Son," Langford said. "I worked that dam for a week," Nathan said. "Miss Whitmore brought lunch out every day and kept the books and worked mortar mix in 100-degree heat. She works there." He looked around at the room like he was daring anyone to argue. "That's all it is." Pete Whitaker put a hand on his son's shoulder, not to quiet him, just to say, "I'm here." Langford's composure held. "The nature of the arrangement,"
is a private matter," said Tomas Ruiz from the back of the room. Langford turned. Ruiz looked back at him with the patience of a man who had nothing to prove and nothing to lose. "The woman appeared in this valley under irregular circumstances," Langford said, shifting his angle. "Under the sponsorship of—" "She appeared in this valley," said Pastor Reed, "because a man left her alone on a train platform in July." The old pastor had not raised his voice. He did not need to. The church had the particular acoustics of a room built for a man's words to carry. "That man is sitting 4 feet to your left, Mr. Langford, and I suggest the discussion of irregular circumstances begin and end there." Fenwick's face went a specific shade of red. Langford's lawyer began to shuffle papers.
And then something happened that Ethan had not expected. Mrs. Holt stood up. Ethan looked at her. Clara looked at her. The entire room looked at her. Mrs. Holt was not a woman anyone would have predicted to be on their side. She had disapproved loudly of Clara from the first day. She had told Ethan directly that people would talk, and it seemed somewhat in favor of the talking. But she stood up. "I have known Ethan Carter for 11 years, she said. Her voice was stiff. She was not comfortable with this, and she was doing it anyway, which Ethan understood was its own kind of courage. "I knew his wife, Margaret. I attended her funeral. I watched that man work his land alone for 6 years without asking a single person in this town for anything." She looked at Langford. "And I watched this town give him exactly that. Nothing." She sat back down. The room was still. Langford looked around at it. For the first time, something behind his composed expression flickered. He had expected resistance from Ethan. He had not done his arithmetic on the room. "The legal matter," Foss began, "is stayed by federal review," Clara said. She said it clearly and without standing up. She said it the way she had said things in a classroom for 7 years. The tone of a person who is accustomed to speaking into a room and having it land. Every head turned to her. "The Abilene Land Office opened a federal review of Mr. Langford's filings this morning," she said. "Sheriff Brooks received the telegram at noon. No local proceeding can advance until the review is complete." She reached into her bag and set a copy of the telegram on the pew beside her. "Anyone who would like to read it is welcome to." The lawyer's shuffling stopped. Fenwick said, "That can't be." "It is," Brooks said from the doorway. He had been standing there the whole time, Ethan realized. Just inside the entrance. Just in case. "I received it. It's legitimate." Langford looked at his lawyer. Foss looked at his documents. Something passed between them. The silent communication of 2 men recalculating. Then Henry Whitaker, 15 years old, Pete's youngest, the boy who had fallen asleep against the dam wall, stood up. He didn't say anything sophisticated. He said, "He fixed our fence when the cattle broke through last winter. He didn't ask us for a thing." Then the widow, Marguerite Collier, stood up. "He cut firewood for me when my husband passed," she said. "Left it on the porch without knocking." Then Lou Gaines, Roy's brother, who ran the smallest outfit in the valley and had borrowed seed from Ethan in the spring of '81 and never forgotten it. Then 2 more. Then 3. They did not make speeches. They said simple things, specific things, the kind of things that could only come from memory. Each one was a small stone placed in a wall, and the wall was being built faster than Langford could tear it down. Langford stood at the front of the room and watched it happen. His lawyer leaned toward him and said something quiet. Langford's expression did not change, but something in his posture changed. A microscopic stiffening, the physical signature of a man who has understood that the room he thought he owned has been rearranged.
He picked up his hat from the front pew. He said, with all the dignity he could collect, "This isn't over." "That's your right," Ethan said. It was the first thing he had said in the meeting. Everyone looked at him. His voice was even. "Take it to Abilene. Take it to Washington if you want. I'll still be on that land." Langford looked at him for a long moment, then at Clara, then at the room. He walked out. Foss followed. Fenwick followed, without looking at anyone, which was its own kind of answer about what kind of man he was. The door closed. The church exhaled.
People talked for a long time afterward, in small clusters on the steps and in the road. Some to Ethan, some to each other. Nathan Whitaker shook Ethan's hand with a grip that said more than he would have known how to put into words at 18. Tomas Ruiz embraced him briefly and said something in Spanish that Ethan's Spanish was not good enough to follow, but that he understood. Pastor Reed found Clara near the door. "You did well in there," he said. "I stated facts," she said. "Facts stated at the right moment, in the right room, take considerable courage." He looked at her with those sharp, old eyes. "I hope you know that." She looked at the floor for a moment, then at him. "I spent 7 years in a classroom where I was the only person fighting for 32 children who had no other advocate," she said. "That teaches you either to be brave or to be useless. I decided early on that useless wasn't an option." Reed nodded. "Ethan Carter," he said, "has been a good man in this valley for a long time. He has just needed—" He paused, choosing the word carefully. "Witness." Clara looked across the room to where Ethan was talking to the Whitaker family, standing with his hat in his hands the way he always did, listening more than he spoke. "I know," she said. They drove back to the Double C in the dark. Luke rode ahead, giving them space without making a thing of it, which was one of the better qualities of a young man who paid attention. The wagon moved slowly through the night. Neither of them spoke for the first mile. Then Clara said, "Do you think he'll take it to Abilene?" "Probably," Ethan said. "He's got pride and money, and both of those are hard to put down." "Can he win there?" "With enough money and the right judge, maybe." "That doesn't frighten you?" It was not a question. She had noticed something in his voice that said it. "It did this morning," he said. "It doesn't as much now." "Because of the meeting?" "Because of the meeting." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been fighting this valley alone for a long time. I forgot." He stopped. "What?" "That I didn't used to," he said. "That when Margaret was alive, we fought things together. And it wasn't—" He paused again. He was choosing carefully. "It wasn't that it was easier. It was that it meant something more. When there was someone standing beside you." The wagon wheels rolled over dry ground. Clara did not fill the silence immediately. She let it sit, the way a woman sits with something that matters. Then she said, "I came west looking for something brave." Her voice was quiet. "I thought that meant leaving everything I knew, starting over." She looked at the dark fields on either side of the road. "I didn't understand that brave isn't about leaving. It's about staying." Ethan looked at her. In the dark he could see the line of her profile, the set of her jaw, the steadiness in the way she held herself even now, even tired, even after everything the day had asked of her. "You planning on staying?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. When she answered, her voice was steady. "I don't have a return ticket," she said. And something in his chest, which had been held very carefully in place for a very long time, shifted by exactly 1 degree. It was a small thing, but in the dark,
on a dry road in a summer that had taken almost everything. 1 degree was the difference between frozen and thaw. He did not say anything else, neither did she. But when the wagon hit a rut and she reached out to steady herself, and her hand landed briefly on his arm, he did not pull away, and she did not move her hand, not for a long time. They were half a mile from the Double C when Luke came riding back toward them at a speed that meant something had changed. "Ethan," he said, pulling up alongside the wagon, breathing hard. "You need to see this." "What is it?" Luke looked at him with an expression that was somewhere between alarmed and something else. Something that didn't quite have a name. Something that arrived when the thing you'd been working toward and the thing you'd been fearing arrived at the same time. "The basin," Luke said. "The dam." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Is it down?" "No," Luke said. Ethan, just come." He turned his horse and rode back, and Ethan snapped the reins and the wagon followed, and Clara held the seat with both hands as they covered the last half-mile faster than was safe. They came over the rise above the east pasture and stopped. In the basin below, in the dark, something was moving. Not Langford's men, not riders. People. Neighbors, arriving from 3 directions with lanterns and tools. The Whitaker family, all 4 of them. Tomas Ruiz and his grown nephew. 2 men Ethan recognized from the back of the church, who had not stood up to speak, but had apparently made a different kind of decision on the road home. They were working the dam, finishing the sections that still needed sealing, reinforcing the base on the eastern side where the rock shelf had forced the reroute. Doing the work quietly, in the dark, without having been asked. Pete Whitaker looked up and saw Ethan on the rise and called out, "You going to stand up there all night, or are you going to come down here and help us finish this?" Ethan did not answer right away. He sat on that wagon on the rise above his land and looked at the lanterns moving in the dark below and felt something move through him that he had no clean word for. Not relief, not gratitude. Something older than both of those. Something that had to do with belonging. He had built walls for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like when people walked through them. Clara was looking at him. He looked back at her, and she had that steady expression of hers, but underneath it something was open. Something was quietly glad. "Told you," she said softly. "Told me what?" "That you weren't building it alone." He picked up the reins. He drove down. They finished the dam at 3 in the morning. Not because they ran out of work. There was always more work on a thing built from stone and hope and borrowed time. But because Pete Whitaker looked at the last sealed joint and said, "That'll hold," with the authority of a man who had built things that held and built things that hadn't and knew the difference. And nobody argued. They stood around the basin in the dark with their lanterns burning low, and nobody said much of anything, which was its own kind of ceremony. Ethan shook every hand. He shook Pete's hand, and Tomas Ruiz's hand, and the 2 men from the back of the church, whose names were Aldridge and Kahn, whom he had helped at different times in different ways, and had not kept score of, because that was not why he had done it. When he got to Nathan Whitaker, the 18-year-old who had spoken first in the church, who had stood up when standing up cost something, he held the handshake a beat longer than the others. "You didn't have to do that tonight," Ethan said. "Any of it." Nathan shrugged, the way young men shrug when they have done something decent and don't know how to accept acknowledgement for it. "My father said a man shows up when it counts." "Your father's right." "Yes, sir," Nathan said. "He usually is. Don't tell him I said so." Pete, who was 3 feet away and had heard every word, said nothing and looked extremely satisfied. They dispersed in 1s and 2s down the dark roads home, the lanterns swinging away through the night until only 3 remained, Ethan and Clara and Luke. standing above the basin. Luke looked at the dam one more time. Then he picked up his tools and said, "I'm going to sleep for approximately 1 year," and walked to the barn, and that was that. Ethan and Clara walked back to the house. At the door, she stopped. He stopped beside her. "The Federal Review," she said. "How long does it take?" "Months," he said. "Maybe longer." "And until then?" "Until then, nobody touches the basin." She nodded slowly. "And Langford?" "Langford will try something else," Ethan said. "He always does. That's the nature of men who've never been told no and made to live with it." He looked at her. "But he's not fighting one man on a failing ranch anymore. He knows that now." She was quiet for a moment. "Tonight changed something." "Yes." "Not just the legal situation." He looked at her in the dark. The lantern she was holding threw soft light across her face. The tiredness there. And underneath the tiredness, something that had been closed for a long time, sitting slightly open. "No," he said. "Not just that." She looked at him. He looked back. And then she said goodnight and went inside. And he stood on the porch for a few minutes in the dark, listening to the valley, before he went in himself. 3 days passed without incident. That was almost more unsettling than the incidents had been. Ethan went to town on Monday for supplies and felt the shift immediately. People looked at him differently. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, but the careful non-acknowledgement that had been the texture of his 6 years alone had changed into something else. Roy Gaines said good morning, and meant it. The man at the hardware store asked about the dam without the undertone of someone waiting for failure. Even Clarence at the telegraph office, who had never had reason to notice Ethan Carter one way or another, gave him a nod that carried some kind of weight. Small things. But small things were how a valley remembered itself. Langford's men were not in town. Langford himself had apparently ridden to Abilene. Roy Gaines had heard it from someone who had heard it from Foss's clerk, which was the most reliable form of information in Caldwell Creek. He was pursuing the Federal Review through channels that cost money and took time, and might or might not arrive at anything useful. Ethan bought his supplies and drove back to the Double C, and didn't let himself believe it was over. Because men like Langford didn't go to Abilene to give up. They went to Abilene to reload. Clara was on the porch when he pulled in. She had a letter in her hand. He knew from her face before he got off the wagon that it was not ordinary correspondence. "From Philadelphia," she said when he reached her. He waited. "My sister," she said. She folded the letter along a crease that said she had folded and unfolded it several times already. "She's heard what happened. Apparently word traveled. Someone wrote to her, I don't know who." "Is she all right?" "She's worried." Clara looked at the letter. "She wants me to come home." The word home landed strangely. Ethan took off his hat. He turned it in his hands. "What do you want to do?" he asked. She looked up at him. "That's the question, isn't it?" "It is." "She says," Clara paused, "she says there are situations a woman shouldn't put herself in for the sake of principles. That's her phrasing. Situations a woman shouldn't put herself in. What do you say?" Clara was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the dry fields and the barn and the line of the east pasture where, if you knew where to look, you could just see the top of the dam. "I say," she said finally, "that every situation I've been in this valley has been worth being in." He looked at her. "Even the train platform?" he said. Something moved in her expression. almost a wince, almost a smile, the particular expression of a person revisiting a pain that has become, through proximity to something better, more bearable than it was. Especially the train platform, she said, because of what came after it. He held her gaze. He was a man who had spent 6 years building walls and calling it self-sufficiency, and he knew it, and she knew he knew it, and the wall had been coming down, one stone at a time, for the past 3 weeks, in ways he hadn't fully accounted for until right now. "I'd like you to stay," he said. He said it plainly, without decorating it. Not as an employee, not... He stopped, looked down at his hat, looked back up at her. "I'd like you to stay because this place is better with you in it. Because I am better with you in it. And I'm aware that's more than I have any particular right to ask." Clara looked at him for a long moment. The steadiness in her eyes had a different quality to it now. Not the closed steadiness of a woman holding herself together in a difficult situation, but the open steadiness of a woman looking at something she has been moving toward without fully naming it. "Ethan Carter," she said. "Are you asking me something?" "I'm working toward asking something," he said. "I'm not there yet." "Take your time," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." And she went back inside. He stood on the porch for a full minute before he realized he was smiling. He hadn't done that in a while. The letter from Abilene arrived on Thursday. Not the Federal Review. That would take months. This was something different. Sheriff Brooks brought it again, and this time he came inside when Clara offered coffee, which he had never done before. And that alone told Ethan that whatever was in the letter required sitting down. Foss, Langford's lawyer, had filed an injunction in the federal court requesting that construction on the dam be declared illegal pending review. Standard procedure. Ethan had half expected it. What he had not expected was the second document. It was a counterclaim filed not by Langford, but against him, by a rancher named Davies who owned land 2 valleys north. Davies was claiming that Langford's 1871 water rights filing had been fraudulent, that the original survey had been altered, and that 3 ranchers in the northern valley had lost land as a direct result. Brooks set the document on the kitchen table. "Davies has been building this case for 2 years, he said. He was waiting for someone else to crack the door open." Clara read the filing quickly. "If this holds..." "If it holds," Brooks said, "Langford's entire water rights framework in this county gets reviewed. Not just the basin. All of it." The kitchen was very quiet. Luke said, from his chair in the corner, "So, we didn't just defend the dam?" "Apparently not," Clara said. "We started something bigger." "Apparently." Luke thought about that for a moment. "Huh," he said. Ethan was looking at the document. He was thinking about the 7 names on a list, and a 40-mile drive to Harker City, and a telegram sent quietly on a Wednesday afternoon while everyone else was working, and how a schoolteacher from Philadelphia, who had been left on a train platform with no plan, had threaded a needle that nobody else had seen. He looked at Clara. "You didn't know about Davies," he said. "No," she said. "But you opened the door." She met his eyes. "I just told the truth to the right office," she said. "The truth has a way of finding other truths when you put it in the right room." Brooks finished his coffee and stood. "Langford comes back from Abilene tomorrow," he said. "He's going to know about the Davies filing by then." "How do you think he'll take it?" Luke asked. Brooks looked at him with the expression of a man who had watched powerful people lose things for 20 years. "Like every man who's never lost takes it," he said. "Badly." He put on his hat and went to the door. He paused. "Ethan," he said without turning, "for what it's worth, I should have done more. These past years. He paused again. I'm doing more now. He left before Ethan could answer. The door closed. Luke looked at the door, then at Ethan. Did the sheriff just apologize to you? Came close, Ethan said. That's something. Yeah, Ethan said. It is. Langford came back from Abilene on Friday afternoon. He came to the Double C himself. No lawyer, no Decker, no riders behind him. Just Victor Langford, on a good horse, riding alone up the road to the Double C in the early afternoon heat. And that alone was enough to make Ethan walk out to meet him in the yard, with a particular kind of attention. The way you pay attention to a thing that has changed its pattern. Clara came to the doorway. Luke appeared at the corner of the barn. Langford pulled up and looked at Ethan, and did not bother with preamble. The Davies filing, he said. I heard about it, Ethan said. It'll take 2 years to resolve. Probably. Could go either way. Probably that too. Langford looked at him. The composed authority that he usually wore like a second suit was present, but something underneath it was different. Not broken, not humble, but recalibrated, the way a man recalibrates when the landscape he has been navigating turns out to have features he missed. The basin, Langford said. I'll withdraw the injunction. Ethan waited. In exchange, Langford said, for a signed agreement that you won't join the Davies claim as a secondary party. Ethan looked at him. The Davies claim isn't about my land. No, Langford said, but your testimony about the pattern of filings would carry weight. He met Ethan's eyes. I'm asking you to stay out of it. It was a real offer, not generous. Langford was not capable of generous in the way ordinary people were, but real. The offer of a man who had done his arithmetic and arrived at a number he could live with. Ethan turned his hat in his hands. He thought about Davies, 2 valleys north, who had been building a case for 2 years. About the other ranchers who had lost land to a fraudulent survey. About what it meant to stay out of it. I won't offer testimony I'm not asked for, he said carefully. That's not my fight. Langford heard the precision in that. But if you're asked. If I'm asked, Ethan said, I'll tell the truth. That's the only thing I've ever been able to offer anyone. Langford was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the dam line on the horizon, at the house, at Clara in the doorway. She's trouble, he said. Not viciously, almost, with a trace of something that was not quite respect, but was adjacent to it. She's the best thing that's happened to this ranch in 6 years, Ethan said. Langford looked at him one more time. Then he turned his horse. I'll have Foss file the withdrawal Monday, he said. He rode away. Luke came out from the barn. Did he just? Yeah, Ethan said. He backed down. He made a calculation, Ethan said. It's not the same thing. He'll find another angle eventually. But not today. Not today. Luke looked at the road where the dust was settling. I'll be honest, he said. I didn't think this was going to work. Neither did I, Ethan said. What changed your mind? Ethan looked at the doorway where Clara was still standing. I stopped doing it alone, he said. The rain came that Sunday. It came the way the best things come, without announcement, without drama, just a shift in the air around 4 a.m. that woke Ethan before the first drop fell. He lay still for a moment, listening to the particular silence that isn't silence at all, but the held breath of a valley waiting. Then it came. Not a drizzle, not a tease, a real rain, the kind the valley had been owed for 2 summers and was now collecting on with interest. Steady and purposeful, soaking into ground that had been waiting so long it took the first inch without showing any change at all, just drinking. He heard Clara's door open. He heard her cross the kitchen. He heard the front door, and then he got up himself. She was on the porch when he came out, standing with her arms at her sides, looking out at the dark where the rain was falling. She was in her nightclothes, with a blanket around her shoulders and her hair down, and she was not trying to be dignified about any of it. She was just standing in the rain, the edge of it reaching the porch, with her face turned up slightly, and an expression that had nothing composed about it at all. Ethan stood beside her. From the barn they heard Luke shout something unintelligible and delighted. From across the pasture, if you listened past the rain, you could hear the first thin sound of water finding the basin, the overflow beginning to collect, the dam doing exactly what it had been built to do, stone by stone, and night by night, and name by name on a list made at a kitchen table by two people who had decided to stop doing things alone. "It's holding," Clara said. "Yeah," he said. She looked at him, rain on her face and something open in her eyes that she wasn't trying to close. "You should look at it," she said. "The basin." "I can hear it from here," he said. He was looking at her. She went still. "Clara," he said. She waited. "I've been thinking about what I was working toward asking," he said, "when we were on the porch." "I remember," she said. "I'm there now," he said. She looked at him in the dark and the rain and the sound of a valley finally drinking, and she said, "Then ask." He reached into his pocket. He had put it there that morning before he knew the rain was coming, before he knew how the day would go, because he had made a decision, and decisions didn't require perfect timing. They just required making. It was a small silver ring, his mother's. It had been in a box in the bureau for 6 years, and he had opened that box twice in 6 years, and both times had closed it again, because there was nothing to do with it yet. There was something to do with it now. "I'm not an easy man," he said. "I know that. I'm quiet, and I'm stubborn, and I have a ranch that's been failing, and a fight that isn't finished, and a valley that's still making up its mind about a lot of things." "I know all of that," she said. "I'm asking you, anyway." She looked at the ring in his hand. She looked at his face. She looked at this man who had walked across a train platform in the July heat to speak to a woman that the entire town had decided wasn't their problem, who had offered honest work and honest pay, and the particular dignity of being treated like someone whose presence mattered, who had not been brave in a showy way, but in the real way, the daily, quiet, costly way that didn't ask for an audience. "Yes," she said. Just that. He put the ring on her finger. Her hand was warm despite the cool air. He held it for a moment before he let go, and she let him. Luke, who had come out of the barn and was standing in the yard getting thoroughly rained on, said, "Is that what I think it is?" "Go back to the barn, Luke," Ethan said. "I'm just saying." "Luke." "Yes, sir." He went back. From inside the barn, muffled but audible, "Yes!" Clara laughed. It was a real laugh, full and warm, the laugh of a woman who had not had many reasons to laugh lately, and was making up for it. Ethan watched it happen, and felt something in his chest that he recognized, distantly, as happiness. He had not felt it in so long that it took him a moment to name it. "He's a good boy," Clara said, recovering. "He's a lot," Ethan said. "He is," she agreed. "He's a lot of good things." They stood together on the porch and listened to the rain work on the land. Somewhere in the east pasture, the basin was filling. Slowly, carefully, the way things fill when they have been empty a long time. The dam stood. The stone held. The valley
drank. The Federal Review took 4 months. Langford's withdrawal of the injunction held, as he had said it would. The Davies claim moved slowly through the federal process in the way legal things do, with delays and filings and counterfilings, and Ethan was asked for a statement in October, and gave one, truthful and plain, and left the lawyers to do what lawyers do. The basin held water through the fall. The cattle that would have died in September were alive in November. The feed store account was brought current. The ledger that Clara had taken apart and rebuilt made sense for the first time in 3 years. And when Ethan looked at it, he could see clearly for once what the ranch owed and what it was worth, and what it could become. Tomas Ruiz brought his wife to dinner on a Sunday in October, and she was small and quiet, and looked at Clara with the assessing eyes of a woman who wanted to know if this person was worthy of a man she respected. And by the end of the meal, she had decided yes, and told Clara so directly, in Spanish, which Clara didn't speak. Tomas translated. Clara said thank you, in the careful Spanish she had been teaching herself, from the primer she'd found in a box under the bureau. And Mrs. Ruiz laughed, and said her accent needed work, and offered to help. They were married in November. Pastor Reed performed the ceremony in the small church where Langford had tried and failed to run them out of the valley. And there was something right about that. Something that made the room feel like it was being used for its correct purpose at last. The Whitaker family came. Tomas and his wife, Luke, who wore his cleanest shirt and had combed his hair with more effort than anyone had ever seen him apply to anything. Mrs. Holt came, which surprised everyone, including Mrs. Holt, and she sat in the second row and did not say anything disapproving, which was the highest form of approval she was capable of. Sheriff Brooks came and stood in the back and left quietly afterward, which was his way. The Davies claim was settled the following spring, in favor of Davies and the northern ranchers. Langford's 1871 survey was declared fraudulent. He did not lose everything. Men with money and lawyers rarely lose everything. But he lost enough that the careful balance of power in the valley shifted into something closer to level. He sold his Caldwell Creek property 2 years later and moved north. The valley did not miss him. 5 years after a woman sat alone on a train platform in the July heat with her hands folded and her dignity intact and nowhere to go, the Double C had 48 head of cattle and a well that ran clean and a kitchen that smelled like something worth coming home to. There was a child by then, a girl, born in the spring of the second year, with Clara's dark eyes and Ethan's stubbornness, and an early talent for expressing her opinion at volume. They named her Margaret, which was a thing Clara had suggested, and Ethan had been unable to speak about for a full minute when she did. Luke was still there. He had built himself a small cabin on the north end of the property, and had established himself as the kind of permanent fixture that nobody had officially formalized, and nobody needed to. He had opinions about everything, and good instincts about cattle, and a loyalty that he expressed through showing up and working hard, and never, not once, letting anyone have the last word without a fight. On a May evening in the 5th year, Ethan sat on the porch of the Double C while Clara read inside and Margaret slept, and the valley went quiet and gold in the last of the light. He thought about the man he had been the day he walked across that train platform. The man who had run out of things to say. The man who called his loneliness self-sufficiency and called his grief practicality, and told himself that the walls he'd built were protection when they were really just distance. He thought about what it had cost him to say 2 words to a woman in a blue traveling dress. Honest work. And what those 2 words had built. Pastor Reed had said at the wedding that some people come into a life like rain on dry ground, not solving the problem all at once, but making the ground capable of holding something again. Ethan had thought about those words many times since. He heard the door, and Clara came out,
and sat in the chair beside him and didn't say anything. And he didn't either, because they had long since stopped needing to fill the quiet between them. After a while, she reached over and put her hand on his arm, the way she had in the wagon on the dark road back from the church meeting that first time, when she hadn't moved her hand and he hadn't pulled away. He covered her hand with his. The valley held them both, and the ranch that had been dying the day he chose to stop walking past her. That ranch breathed easy now, in the evening, under a sky that had learned to give back what it had taken. Some things that break can't be fixed, but some things that break find exactly the person they needed to break in front of. And that is the whole story of how Ethan Carter, who had stopped believing in tomorrow, got it back.